student of BA Sociology Honours from Banaras Hindu University, welcomes you all from the Discourse Society. The Discourse is a student-centric society of BHU which majorly holds discussion sessions, offline and online seminars on various and significant current issues concerning social sciences, because discussions is a best way to crystallize our thoughts and have a productive conclusions. And our today's online session is going to be very enlightening, whose topic is the sociological perspective. Uh, okay, so introducing our speaker, which you all might know, Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri ma'am. Speaking about ma'am, so ma'am taught at the Center of Study of Social Systems, CSSS, Jawaharlal Nehru University from 1990 to 2021, and currently she is the president of Indian Sociological Society. She has written widely on feminism, media, academia, and pedagogy. Her key publications include Women's Movement in India, Reform and Revival, The Practice of Sociology, Feminism in India, and her recent books are Refashioning India, Gender, Media, and a Transformed Public Discourse in 2017, and Doing Theory, Location, Hierarchies, and Disjunctions in 2018. Adding one more feather in ma'am's cap, she is one of the three founding members of blog Sociology for accessible but informal discussions, that is Doing Sociology, which has the site http://doingsociology2020.blogspot.com, which you can access through LinkedIn, and it has a personal website too. Now, moving towards the session, before we begin, I just want to go over a few points to which the audience should imbibe as the code of conduct of today's session. That is, please do not turn your microphone and video in between the session, and we'll try to provide the recorded lecture of the session after it through our YouTube channel. The link will be provided to you through our groups. Now, I'd like to hand over the screen to ma'am to enlighten the students with her words of wisdom. Thank you so much. Hello. Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, now I have, through the host controls, I have done that. You can unmute yourself now. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are perfectly audible.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Chanchal, for introducing me. And thank you, the Discourse Society, for, organizing this session on the sociological perspective. I am very, very impressed by the fact that you are BA students and that you are doing this. So are all the organizers from the undergraduate, or some are from the postgraduate? Yeah. So anyway, let me sort of begin. I'll speak for about half an hour, and then we could proceed. That what is the sociological perspective? And very often we also have somehow, not very clear idea when we use the word perspective. Perspective is, as you know, a way of looking at any particular phenomena, a way of looking at anything, like what is your perspective about politics, or your perspective about this particular film, or your perspective about, maybe clothes or fashion. The perspective is basically looking at. Now, the first question that arises is that, is there one sociological perspective, or can we use the word sociological perspective in the singular? That whatever may be the different theories that we study in class, and all of you would be familiar that you have, the functionalist perspective, the structural functionalist perspective, the Marxist perspective, the feminist perspective, the ethnometeorological theoretical frame. So you have various kinds of theoretical perspective. But when there is something which is common amongst all these different kinds of theoretical frame, and that is what is common to the sociological perspective. The sociological perspective, when we use that particular time, there are a couple of other words which we also associate with the sociological perspective. We distinguish our perspective from what we often call the common sense perspective, the ordinary, everyday way of looking at things. The kind of routine manner that we look at particular phenomena. The common sense perspective defines the way we think, the way we talk, the way we speak, the way we have ideas about society. Many of you would be familiar with Emily Durkheim's rule of sociological method. And in that particular book, he makes a very interesting observation. He says that, look, human beings did not wait for sociology to emerge to have ideas about society. When we are born and as we grow up, we learn the language which our family uses. We learn the religious practices of the family in which religion we are born into. We learn about what is good, what is bad, morals, customs, traditions, culture, depending upon the family that we are born into. So the little baby, this is an example I often give, and that's an example which interestingly Durkheim gives, is that when a baby is born, and I'm sure in all your family, you would know when a new baby is born, the whole family complains that the baby sleeps soundly during the day, and at night, जब सब लोग थक जाते हैं, the baby suddenly decides कि यही time है to start playing or to be hungry. And the baby, over a period of time, it learns to sleep at specific points of time, learns to be hungry at specific points of time. In other words, what Durkheim is arguing, that the self, the body, the individual is socially constituted and learns everything from society. And importantly, when it comes to perspective, it also learns a particular way of, looking at any particular kind of phenomena. So as you grow up, all of you know that you are taught कि ये नहीं करना चाहिए, ये करना चाहिए. If you are a girl, आपको ये कपड़े नहीं पहनना चाहिए. If you are a boy, it would be told that आप रो मत because boys don't cry. This is a common sense perspective. Where does the sociological perspective differ from the common sense perspective? What the sociological perspective does, it is always comparative. It is never specific to the ethnicity, caste, community, religion, region, nation that you belong to. The first difference is this. So in our own families, we know that all of us have a particular kind of food that we eat. We have particular customs that we follow. And when we go to a hostel, maybe far away to another state, or maybe go to the south, or go abroad, or go to the northeast, and you realize that they eat differently, or they have a particular way of dressing up. And you say, देखो, look, they are so different. Or you make judgments, कि वो तो सही नहीं है, and ours is right. Where the sociological perspective differs from common sense perspective, that it looks at all forms of social organization from the same vantage point. They will study families and they will not make normative judgment कि ये family सही है और वो family गलत है. This kind of family organization is good and that is bad. That is not part of the sociological perspective. The sociological perspective will ask which kind of societies have which kind of families. They bring in the context. Which context is this family located or situated in? So the question will be asked, what kind of society is it? Do women participate in the labor force? Is property rights part of the rights of women? Say if you take the example among the Khasis or at earlier period among the Nayars in Kerala, you know they are matrilineal society. Line of descent is from the mother to the daughter to the granddaughter. Not only is the line of descent from the mother to the daughter to the granddaughter, property is also from the mother to the daughter to the granddaughter. When you get married, instead of leaving your Maika and going to your the husband's house, you remain there and the husband comes in. It's not patrilocal, but it is matrilocal. Patrilocal is when the girl gets married and shifts residence to another house. Matrilocal in the other is the obverse. So the young boy gets married and decides to shift, or is part of the kinship structure, the marriage structure. The sociological perspective, therefore, defamiliarizes, you can write down this word, makes things unfamiliar, defamiliarizes, and you start asking questions that which kind of agricultural society or which historical point is this kind of family possible? Which kind of societies have nuclear families? Which kind of family societies or economies have extended families? Why in our country, landed communities, trading communities are more likely to have extended families. And when you have professional classes, they are more likely to be nuclear families. Or if you look at the marginalized section, the chances of a construction worker living in an extended family is less likely. So what does the sociological perspective do? It makes relationships. This kind of economy, polity, kinship, legal structure leads to this kind of family. What does the common sense perspective do? The common sense perspective says, if somebody asks a common sense question that आप लोगों में शादी इतनी जल्दी क्यों होती, the answer would be हमारे में ऐसा ही होता है, ये हमारे रिवाज है. But a sociological perspective will ask, why are they getting their daughters married so early? Is it something to do with questions of honor? Is it questions about fear of the girl's sexual safety? Is it about the idea of purity and pollution? Is it control over the woman? A lot of other kinds of questions arise. So the sociological perspective always defamiliarizes. It also debunks, it questions, it interrogates, it does not accept anything for granted. As I said, it compares. It, in other words, looks through the facades. It looks and peers behind what you can look at and start asking questions about what is not generally apparent. I'll give you an example. I will also ask you that when you go back to your rooms or to your libraries, there is this absolutely wonderful book by Peter Berger, Invitation to Sociology. And you must read it and you will understand what he means by saying sociology always looks behind, peers behind. Like in our houses, we will say when children play, वो छुप जाते हैं, maybe उनको they hide behind below the bed, तो आपको फिर वो ढूंढना पड़ता, you have to peer, ऊपर से दिखता नहीं, you have to look at it and discover it. The sociological perspective, therefore, is something which looks behind the empirical, behind what you see. It questions what we see and what we perceive. And this facade, Peter Berger was in Germany, and as you know, in the World War II, Germany was bombarded heavily. Every day buildings would be bombarded, homes would be destroyed. So Peter Berger says that in peace times, when he would walk in the streets of a German city, he would find neat houses, curtains drawn, and he could not see what was happening inside the house. But he said, once they started getting bombed, and you suddenly start walking and you find a whole wall, the front wall, the facade of the building gone, and you can see behind what was there, maybe a dining table, maybe a doll, maybe some clothes, maybe a broken crockery, small things which he could not see when the wall was there. Now, in society, The argument is that what we see is not suffice. We have to look behind it. We have to look at causes which are behind the facade. All of you know about Durkheim's attempt to understand suicide as a social fact, where he tried to say that suicide is not psychological, but there is a pattern. The sociological perspective is always about patterns. And he studied the data of suicide rates among Catholics and among Protestants. And he found that there was more suicide rates among Protestants as against suicide rate among Catholics. Now, very often in the contemporary context, a lot of people are confused and they feel the sociological perspective is just description or just counting. So if Durkheim said, look, there's more suicide among Catholics and less suicide among Protestants, he would have made a descriptive comment. He would have just counted and put it there. This is not the sociological perspective. The sociological perspective goes behind and asks, but why? Why is it different between these two communities? And the answer he found was in the way people were connected to each other, social integration. People were connected to each other, which were more closely bonded. So among the Catholics, people were more closely bonded. Individualism was less. And people, the religious structure was also where you could go back and ask maybe the priest, why is this right or why is this wrong? They would be advised, monitored, you would sin, you would go and confess. There was a structure by which you could share and look at ideas and prescriptions. The Protestants, which wanted the idea of reaching out to God directly and a society marked by more individual quest, when you're searching for the divine individually rather than collectively, the social bonding between different individuals was less. So when there was a crisis, the possibility of the individual having to battle alone was far more. It is like when you are maybe now in Benares and you have your family, you have your relatives, you have your friends, you have everybody around you. But maybe tomorrow you will get a fellowship and you go away very far away. Maybe come to Delhi, but maybe even go abroad, maybe go to Boston. And there's very often young people feel very lost and they start feeling a lot of mental issues, health issues, because they're alone. Now, the idea of individual loneliness. So when Durkheim is trying to explain through the sociological perspective what is suicide, you are seeing that he's going beyond the empirical, he's going beyond the facade, he's defamiliarizing. नहीं तो आम लोगों में कॉमन सेंस आइडिया ये होता कि सुसाइड तो साइकोलॉजिकल डिसऑर्डर से होता. They do not locate suicide in social context. But once he did it, what it did was it debunked existing knowledge about suicide. It debunked existing common sense attitudes about suicide. So you notice the sociological perspective, one, looks beyond, looks behind, asks question, does not accept anything as taken for granted. So for example, with gender, and I'm very impressed that you have this young woman in BA being part of this discourse society. Now, you have a situation very often in our own country, not too long ago, maybe 100 years ago, or even a little earlier, or even now today, where people will say that it is dangerous for women to study. And people will ask, but why is it dangerous? They say, there is danger to gharo mein rakho, or you get them married. Now, interestingly, this is not enough if you are doing sociological perspective. Common sense में it's all right, दिल से जल्दी शादी कर दो, नहीं तो बहुत झंझट होगा. Common sense is practical knowledge. Common sense is practical knowledge, but it never questions the structure of society. It does not ask, but why should girls get married early? Or why is the society dangerous? I ask you again to read this wonderful, very short essay by Rokia Hussain called Sultana's Dream. You'll find it on the internet, Rokia Hussain, Sultana's Dream, just few pages. And this is a story about Ladyland, where everybody is a lady or a woman, and the story is about a dream. So this young person falls asleep and dreams, and in that dream there is this person called Sister Sarah who says, let's come with me and we will walk in the gardens of Ladyland. So they start walking, and this protagonist asks, but where are the men? Kahin pe dikh nahi raha, where are the men? And Sister Sarah says that in our country, hamare desh mein, the men are in parda. The men are at home. So then this protagonist asks, but why? Why are they at home? This is so cruel. आप जबरदस्ती उनको अंदर क्यों रख दिया, बंद कर दिया? Then Sister Sarah answers, look, take an example. Supposing there is a dangerous lion who escapes from the zoo or escapes the forest and comes into your village and starts attacking and killing everybody. What will you do? Will you put the lion back into this, a prison or back behind a cage, or will you put all the people in the village behind the cage? So when you do a forced seclusion, saying it is dangerous, you are making the victim suffer instead of organizing society in a fashion which makes it general. Now you notice here again that in Rokia, she was not a sociologist, but she is what is today called an early gender theorist and early feminist. This book was written in 1905. She is defamiliarizing, meaning making things look different, look unfamiliar, because the very idea of men being in parda is so unfamiliar. It is so strange. But by looking at this strange thing, you start realizing, okay, that means there is a social structure within the forced seclusion of women, early marriage of women, lack of education for women work. And that has to be understood not as individual behavior, but has to be located in the context of a patriarchal society. So sociological perspective will always look into the structure of a society within which many kinds of behavior or practices can be understood. A lot of people think sociological perspective is about data, about statistics, about counting. Now, if you read Peter Berger, you will read that he writes, statistical data by themselves do not make sociology. They become sociology only when they are sociologically interpreted, put within a theoretical frame of reference, that is sociological. Simple counting or even correlating different items that one counts is not sociology. Remember this, just counting is not sociology. Only correlating is also not sociology. If Durkheim had stopped saying Catholics, high suicide rate, Protestant, low suicide rate, he would not be doing sociology. Only when he related the integration, social integration, with the rate of suicide, it becomes sociological. It becomes a sociological perspective. Now we come to another point that very often people say the sociological perspective is about procedures. In my class, I'm retired now, I don't teach, but in the class, whenever I would ask people what is different in sociology from common sense, they would say it's systematic. Now, systematic, we are systematic in doing many things. When we cook, if you're not systematic, you can't cook efficiently. If you don't clean your house systematically, you can't do it efficiently. But where the scientific canons of sociological perspective is that you bring a scientific ethos. And what do we mean by scientific ethos? It means everywhere a willingness to be bound by certain scientific canons or procedure. Statements must be arrived at through the observation of certain rules of evidence. Remember this word, certain rules of evidence that allows others to check or to repeat or develop findings further. It is not enough in the sociological perspective कि मुझे सुनाई दिया, मैंने सुना, ये कहावत है, or somebody gossiped, or हमारे चाचा ऐसे कहते थे. That is not enough. You have to put it through certain kinds of scientific canons of procedure. You can say that, look, I talked to 500 people. You can say, which is oral questioning, you can say that I did a purposive sample, meaning that if you have a particular village where there is maybe 5% landed community of a particular caste or a religion, and you have that many who are have a small piece of land but also have to work elsewhere, or you have people whose land is not enough and they migrate as migrant construction workers or workers in the urban sector. Your sample must be representative of the structure of the village. So if you have only 5% who come from a landed community, your sample should represent that 5%, or whatever size that you take. If you find that women are of that particular percentage, likewise, you must bring gender in. You must bring in maybe landless labor is maybe 60%. You have to do that. Maybe middle class landed is a particular percentage. You have to make sure that your sample represents that. There is a scientific canon of procedure. You can't just start randomly. Isko bhi sawal pooch lo, usko bhi. If you are doing that, then that is an initial process by which you can move to the other person, by which you are getting a hang of the village. Very often there are issues about qualitative research and quantitative research. Now, for that also, you have to have a reason. Why did I do a qualitative study? Why did I not do a quantitative study? Main thing, you have to understand that every theory and every method has a biography. What do I mean by that? It is like every one of you are born in a particular place. You're born to a particular kind of family, class, caste, religion, community, tribe, ethnicity, linguistic group. Every one of us goes to a particular school, has certain experiences, so you have a biography. When we read sociology, we somehow miss this point, that even sociology has a biography, it has a history. Every concept has a history, a biography. Every method has a history or a biography. So qualitative method, ethnography, where you spend a long time in a field, learn their language, live immersed in that field, usually of a community different from yours, began with colonialism. And the beginning of anthropology, where you studied simple society, Jinmei, there was no history, recorded written history. There was no archives, there were no texts. So you had to actually live there, learn their language, and get a hang of that society. So ethnography began in a particular historical context. It was looking at the everyday life of those societies. It was looking at the way the culture, tradition, economy, polity, all of them were interlinked. How did the quantitative method emerge? And which was the first defining method in sociology. It emerged in the developed society when they studied their own societies. So in Britain, after the Industrial Revolution, very often you had large-scale slums. If you see old pictures of London during that period, or if you have read Charles Dickens, garibi tha, poverty tha, bad sanitation, slums, child labor. And in that, the argument was that once sociology as a science felt that poverty or bad sanitation or deaths in sewer pipes is not divinely ordained. They happened because of the structure of society. It was human. Human societies are humanly constructed. Social problems, therefore, are humanly constructed, and therefore, sociology, if they understand human problems, they can solve it. Sociology is therefore, the sociological perspective is a mode of understanding. Social work, in contrast, is a practice. Good social work can happen if you have an understanding of society. So social work will only happen if there is good sociology to back it up. So remember, whether quantitative, whether qualitative, whether ethnography, whether huge surveys, every method has to be understood in its historical specificity. If you're doing mixed method, the question will arise, why are mixed methods more familiar now? Do simple societies as they existed in the 19th century exist anymore? No, it has changed. So remember, sociology is also not fixed. It changes. Maybe the sociology that I studied is different from yours. When I studied in JNU in my master's, there was no course on gender. There was nothing called women's studies, nothing at all. It emerged at a particular period of time. So the gender perspective also emerged after the women's movement in the 1970s, the UN International Decade for Women in 1975. A lot of feminist scholarship, protests, discussions, the report towards equality in 1975. There was a historical moment which led to the emergence of a perspective. Likewise, the sociological perspective emerged at a particular point of time of great change and transformation, which was taking place with the advent of industrial capitalism, scientific methods, French Revolution, democratic ideas. The shift, if you read Comte, from a metaphysical, theological to a scientific understanding of society. So when we talk about the sociological perspective, you must remember it defamiliarizes, it is comparative, it is not content with what we can only see at the surface, the facade. We must peer behind, but we can't peer behind without methods. The scientific discipline supplies the motive for reading a sociological work as, say, a novel on the same topic, because we have rules of evidence. Literature also produces wonderful depiction of society, family, caste, gender, marriage, everything. But what is different in sociology is that we develop a kind of rules of evidence where we say, look, was our method. This was where I came from. This could be my bias. I tried to avoid it by talking both to men and in women. Like Andre Bethé's study on Tanjore village was often criticized that he lived in the Brahmin, neighborhood, which made him, identified with the Brahmin community in a caste society. So how would that have oriented others to see him? So what happens in the sociological perspective, we look at not only the sociologists who study society, but we also accept the fact that people who we are studying are also looking back at us. It is a dialogic relationship. So you have what is called a reflexive turn in the sociological perspective, saying it's not enough to ask them questions and write down their answers. It is important to have a theoretical understanding of society if you have to have an understanding of sociological problem. The sociological perspective is different from the legal perspective. The sociologist often deals with very unofficial conceptions. For the lawyer, the essential thing is to understand how the law looks at a certain type of criminal. For the sociologist, it is important to see also how the criminal looks at the law. That is, nothing is outside the gambit or the scope of the sociological perspective. You can study gangsters, murderers, mobsters. You can study the most respectable. You can study religion. Nothing is beyond the sociological perspective. The sociological perspective, if I have to define from Peter Berger, can be understood in terms of phrases such as seeing through, looking behind, very much as phrases would be employed in common speech, seeing through his game, looking behind the scene, trying to figure out why are they saying this. Sociological perspective also is linked fundamentally to freedom, to democracy. Total respectability of thought, Peter Berger says, invariably means the death of sociology. This is one of the reasons why genuine sociology disappeared in totalitarian countries, as in the case of Nazi Germany. By implication, sociological perspective, sociological understanding is potentially dangerous to the minds of policemen and other guardians of public order, since it always tends to relativize the claim to absolute rightness upon which minds like to rest. I began in my own area by studying gender. And when I was very young and I would give a lecture on gender and gender rights and men and women's problems, a lot of people would say, but हमारे घरों में ऐसा नहीं है. हमारे घरों में everybody is free. Now, the fact that people feel that when you start studying family, gender, religion, caste, community, you are personally affected. You're emotionally vulnerable. And therefore, it becomes a very profound way of interrogating, profound way of debunking. The sociological perspective will be driven time and again by the very logic of his discipline or her discipline to debunk the social system she or he or they are studying. The roots of debunking in sociology are not psychological, but methodological. I will stop over here, and if you wish to, you could, ask me questions. So I would leave it now for Chanchal to carry on. Thank you once again very, very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now, I'd like to request the audience, if you have any queries, please type it in the chat box section. The chat box section is open, I think so, yeah. So you can write it there. Everything present here. If you want to ask something, please type it in the chat section.
Don't hesitate. Ask anything you feel like. अगर हमारे टॉक के साथ आपका सवाल का कनेक्शन है, फिर प्लीज डू दैट. अच्छा, बेसिक बुक्स. Shall I answer this, Chanchal?
Yes, ma'am. Please.
Yeah. So, Alicia, there are, I myself have been involved in 2004-5 when writing the NCERT textbooks. There have been some changes, not dramatic, but some small changes. You will find them online in there. There are 4 books. 2 books for class 11 and 2 books for class 12. Many of the examples are drawn from India, so it may be very productive. Anthony Giddens has a wonderful book called Sociology, a textbook. Again, very easy to understand, ordinary examples. My own bias is against books, guidebooks. लोगों को कहना कि गाइड बुक्स आर वेरी इजी, बट गाइड बुक्स आर रियली नॉट इजी. बहुत सारे डेफिनेशंस डाल देते और इट इज नॉट सिंपल टू अंडरस्टैंड. So I would suggest to go through all the 4 NCERT textbooks as well as your Anthony Giddens book, and not so much Ritzer or Johnson or whatever. The other question is, what are the various approaches of researching data and sociology in terms of quantitative and qualitative research? Now, the first thing is that I wanted to emphasize the distinction between common sense sociology and, a kind of method-based way of looking at the study of society. So when you say approaches, there are 3 different elements in any research. The first element is that there are many theoretical approaches by which you can study a particular phenomenon. So, for example, you want to study, the whole question of why during the pandemic, during the COVID, there was a dropout rate of girls from education, and also a lowering of the rate, the age of marriage. Then you ask the question that you have to first understand the structure of society. So you will need to understand what is a patriarchy. Patriarchy in the sense that why were girls being dropped out? Why is it unsafe for girls to go out into public sphere? What are the reasons for this? So that you have to then study, maybe depending if you're looking at gender, you have to look at some basic feminist texts. There are lots of writings which tell you about what this kind of approach is. If you wish to bring in a kind of perspective which wants to study the family system and how the family system is changing, then you have to read up on the questions of family. So whenever you do any kind of research, a little bit of background reading is mandatory. You can't just suddenly say कि देखिए हमने qualitative study करने लग जाएंगे. You have to study कि supposing you want to study the weavers of Banaras, उसमें बहुत सारे काम हो चुका. You must look at some of them and say, I'm not so interested in the market aspect as I'm interested in labor. So then you have to look at the question on debates on labor, unorganized labor, contractual labor, flexible labor, that how very often now you have the putting out system. You have to understand what neoliberalism is. You have to understand contractual labor. So depending upon the topic, कोई fixed approach नहीं होता. But जिस टॉपिक पे आप काम करना चाहते हैं, उस टॉपिक पे जो एग्जिस्टिंग बढ़िया लिटरेचर है वो जरूर पढ़िए. डोंट रीड टू मच, बट रीड द राइट पीपल कि लेबर पे कौन काम किया, जेंडर पे कौन काम किया. दैट वुड बी वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. So it's not so much approaches. You can also have a mixed method where you use both quantitative methods and qualitative methods. How does sociological perspective invite us to look at a familiar surrounding? That's a wonderful question, Ria. That is what I was trying to tell, that, you sort of, I'll give you an example. When the first time I went to the West, I went to Europe, and in our country, we always walk on the left side of a corridor. Automatically, बिना सोच के, because it's become part of our familiar way of walking. So when I started walking on the left, I suddenly saw जैसे traffic का होता, that people were all walking from the opposite side so I learned that I have to work on the right side and not on the left side. Then I realized that, look, what I thought was automatic, what was natural, was actually socially constructed. So we know where to cross the road. We know that, this is what we should do. For example, I know there's a particular, how do we greet people? So, the first time when I went to an English medium school, and as a very young girl, little girl, and I found it very difficult to address the teacher in English, you, because in Bengali, which is my mother tongue, we make a distinction between tu, tum and आप. तो मुझे लगा कि अगर मैं यू बोलूं तो ये बहुत अजीब सा बात होगा. It would be showing disrespect. So the sociological perspective invites us to look at how we behave in a particular way. In fact, I was asking somebody, because I was not familiar, that in parts of UP, I think in Banaras too, there is a tendency among certain sections to say pranam rather than say namaste or namaskar. Now, I didn't know it, because in my context, pranam always meant touching the feet physically, but you don't verbalize it, you don't say it. So it looks at the familiar surroundings in a fresh way. Maybe, the way we look at the West and how they look at us, it makes things look different. Harshita, in use of both qualitative and quantitative methods, a good idea in a research. I'm a sociology student without statistics background. I feel these days most people assume it lacks legitimacy. I don't think you should be bothered about legitimacy, because I told you just counting doesn't make it sociology. But you can have a brilliant sociological study which is using statistical tools. Statistics is a tool. Ethnography is a tool. These are methods by which you can get data. You can have a very poor quantitative study जहाँ पे बहुत सारे ऐसा होता है. आप tables लिख लीजिए, 10 people said no, 5 people said yes, that kind of finding which says nothing. So it's not statistics which will make it legitimate. It will be your grounding theoretically and methodologically, which will give you the kind of legitimacy. But you have to read. People will start taking your work seriously if you put in a lot of work, But there will always be a bias. Even as I'm retired and old, people will say, "Aha, aap to gender karte hai," So if somebody says, "Aap give us a talk," and I'll say, "Okay, किस पे talk do?" बोलता आप gender gender करते हैं. So lack of legitimacy is in fact part of the sociological question. I've written on this. If you look at some of my writings, like The Practice of Sociology or Sociology in India, you will see this whole question of legitimacy even about the discipline. A little about social fact. How can you figure out this social fact and this is not? Okay, Shraddha. I'll give a common example from my own life. I was speaking to a kind of meeting where you had a lot of developmental organization and a kind of government officials at the meeting, and the idea was to talk about gender. And I was talking about dowry, and I gave the example of Durkheim, and I said, that what does Durkheim say is a social fact, and as you know, he gives certain criteria that is external, that even if before you're born, it exists. So dowry exists in many of our societies, even before you're born. It's external. It predates you. It is social, that it doesn't begin because every individual does it, but because it already exists. It is, in other words, general. And general not in the sense ki aggregate. It's not because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 isliye general hai, but general because it predates the individual. So I said it's external, it is coercive. Jabardasti hai ispe. And then the people told me that बिल्कुल जबरदस्ती नहीं है, हम तो प्यार से अपनी बेटियों को जो देना है देते हैं. So I said ठीक है, फिर आप 1 साल बाद शादी के 1 साल बाद क्यों नहीं देते हैं? And the moment I said that why can't you give it after 1 year because it's only about love, they said ऐसा कैसा कर सकते हो? एक बात भी तो है, we have to be careful. But बच्ची को तो हम ऐसे endanger नहीं कर सकता, And the moment they said it, then I said, then is it not coercive? Is it not coercive? And if you remember, Durkheim also says, if you violate that, अगर आपका confusion है कि ये social fact है कि social fact नहीं है, तो आप देखिए, his final test was, कोई भी social fact या social का खिलाफ आप चले जाएंगे, is there reaction? Is there reaction against it in any society? Then you will know. Say, for example, there are some interesting books in our country which says why loiter. Just say, when I was a young girl growing up in a town, so all my brothers' friends, they would go and stand in the, the square, the market square hai, वहाँ पे people would hang around, the young boys would hang around, and no young girls would hang around. I would just go to the market with my mother and come back with my mother. Now, supposing at a particular point of time in my life, I decided कि बहुत हो गया and I want to go to the market on my own. And I remember, that is many, many years ago, many decades ago, that people will say, ये नहीं कर सकता. Then you realize that the mobility of the woman is a social fact because there is reaction against it. There is a reaction against it. Now, from which perspective we may study the challenges faced by female street vendors in vending zone, whether it's a socialist feminist or we may employ any other perspective. I'm a little careful about using terms like socialist feminism or liberal feminism. Therefore, I'm using more loose terms. Say, you should read a lot on unorganized labor. And a lot of the unorganized labor is a mix of what you would say Marxist ideas about labor, organization of society, as well as feminism. So you could do it the way you wish to. You could do a qualitative, quantitative ethnography, but you'll have to understand also which section do women work as street vendors, and do they work alone or do they work with others. One of my students, Gayatri Nair, she's teaching in Delhi in IIIT. She has a book where she worked among the coolies in Mumbai. and the fish vendors in Mumbai. It's a book which has come out from OUP. The author's name is Gayatri Nair. I don't remember the exact title, but you could just Google. You all are so lucky, and you will find. But when you Google, be very careful about not reading. A lot of rubbish is also on the internet. So read established scholars, scholarship, which is good. You're okay. Can one analyze particular topic from different perspective? Oh, of course you can, very much so. You can analyze anything from multiple perspective. Say you take the macro sociological perspective and the micro sociological perspective. Now, when you want to study maybe the way women behave in a particular fashion, you will have to look at the micro. That is, how do they behave? Like a lot of people at home, they will say, you want to ask your father for some money to buy certain thing, and your mother will say कि उनका mood जब ठीक होगा तभी पूछना. Now, this is micro dynamics, micro sociology. But जब अगर इसको अगर macro तरीके से देखोगे, then the issue is that a man has the freedom to have his moods. Women rarely have the freedom to have their moods. Your mother, whether she's very tired or irritated, उनका वो मौका ही नहीं देंगे कि yes today she is very irritated, उनको और गुस्सा आ गया और वो गुस्सा दिखा दिया या कुछ तोड़ दिया. That is outside. So it can be done from the macro perspective of understanding patriarchal structure, but it can be done from a micro ethnomethodologist perspective, Goffman's perspective or any other kind of perspective कि local level पे classroom में लोग अलग-अलग लोग कैसे behave कर सकते हैं. So I think your group was fantastic, wonderful questions, and thank you again, for inviting me to the Discourse Society. Yeah, before I end, one special request. I was introduced as the president of the Indian Sociological Society. I really invite you to become life members if it's possible, and if not, become student members and do attend the conference which we are holding in December 22nd to 24th at Munjal University, NCR, Gurgaon, Haryana. And I'm really looking forward to reaching out to young people and making sociology a very, very exciting and important and legitimate discipline. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. We pay a heartfelt gratitude to you from the whole Discourse Society for gracing today's online session, and this is truly overwhelming for us. Thank you so much for giving time for this lecture session amid your busy schedule and sharing your insights over the sociological perspective and beautifully explaining the difference between common sense and sociological perspective with easy examples and the importance of questioning spirit in this discipline. And lastly, sociology is all about finding strange in general and general in strange. So I thank you very much, ma'am. And I also like to forward the thanks to our wonderful audience for being very much attentive and patient throughout the session following the code of conduct. And I hope in future also we'll get the opportunity to have you with us once again. So thank you all. Thank you so much.
Yeah, there is a question about can students join? Very much. There is a particular membership only for students. Please look at the